The wind came screaming across the prairie like it had a grudge against every soul still breathing. It rattled the loose boards of the little town of Red Hollow and carried dust through the crooked streets like restless ghosts, and most folks had already shut their doors tight for the night. But one figure still walked the road alone, a young woman with tired boots and shaking hands. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and the cold had crept into her bones hours ago. Her thin dress clung to her legs, while the desert night dropped lower and meaner. Every step felt heavier than the last, and though the lanterns of the town glowed faintly ahead, she wasn't sure she had the strength to reach them, because the truth was simple and cruel. Clara Whitfield had nowhere left to go. She had come west, chasing hope, like so many before her, riding wagons, walking dusty trails, and sleeping beneath stars that looked kinder than the world below them. But hope had a funny way of slipping through your fingers in places like Red Hollow. The ranch that promised her work had closed after a cattle fever wiped out the herd. The boarding house turned her away when she couldn't pay another night, and the few coins she carried had long since vanished into the pockets of men who sold bread to stale and water to warm. So Clara kept walking because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant becoming just another forgotten story buried under prairie grass across the street. The swinging doors of the Broken Spur saloon creaked open, and a tall cowboy stepped out into the cold night air. His name was Jack Mercer, a man folks around these parts knew well enough to nod to, but not well enough to cross. He carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen more than he talked about. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, and his coat hung heavy on his shoulders. Thick brown wool, worn soft by years of hard winters. Jack paused on the porch when he spotted the woman stumbling near the end of the street. Because in towns like this, you learned to mind your own business. But something about the way she walked made it hard to look away. Clara barely noticed him at first. The cold had wrapped around her thoughts like barbed wire, and the world blurred into shapes and lantern light. Her knees buckled once, and she grabbed the fence beside her to keep from falling. The wood felt like ice beneath her fingers, and that was when she heard boots on the dirt behind her. Slow, steady footsteps that made her stiffen with worry. Out here, strangers could mean trouble, but the voice that followed carried a calm steadiness instead of threat. The cowboy stopped a few steps away and said quietly that she looked like she was about to freeze clear through, and before she could answer, he pulled off his heavy coat and held it out toward her for a moment. Clara just stared at the coat as if it might disappear. Pride told her not to take it. The stubborn piece of her that had survived the long road west whispered she should refuse. But the wind cut straight through her thin sleeves and made the choice for her. She took the coat slowly, almost carefully, like it was something fragile and rare. The moment the wool settled over her shoulders, warmth spread through her body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The coat smelled faintly of leather, campfire smoke, and the dry grass of open plains, and for the first time that night, Clara felt something close to safe. Jack watched her pull the coat tight around herself and nodded once, like the matter had already been decided long before either of them spoke. He told her there was a stable down the road where the owner didn't ask too many questions, a warm loft above the horses where travelers sometimes slept. His voice stayed quiet and simple, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. Clara thanked him, though the words came out small and shaky, and when she looked back up to return the coat, he lifted a hand and shook his head slowly, telling her to keep it until morning, because nights out here had a way of biting harder than folks expected. She walked toward the stable with the coat wrapped around her like a shield against the cold world. Each step felt lighter than the one before. The wind still howled across Red Hollow, but it no longer felt like an enemy trying to drag her down. When she reached the stable door, she turned once more toward the street. The cowboy had already disappeared into the dark, swallowed by the shadows between buildings, but his coat stayed warm around her shoulders, and Clara realized something strange in that quiet moment. She hadn't just been given warmth, she had been given a small piece of kindness in a world that rarely bothered with such things. That night, Clara slept in the hayloft above the horses, wrapped tight in the heavy brown coat, while the animals shifted softly below, and the prairie wind roared outside the wooden walls. The coat felt too big for her, but she didn't mind. It carried a steady warmth that made the dark feel less lonely, and somewhere deep inside she held on to the memory of the quiet cowboy who had handed it to her without asking anything in return. She told herself she would return it in the morning, that it was only borrowed for one cold night, but as sleep finally closed her tired eyes, Clara Whitfield didn't yet know that the coat resting over her shoulders would follow her far longer than a single winter night. and that the man who gave it to her would change the road ahead in ways neither of them could see coming. Morning came slow over Red Hollow, pale sunlight creeping across the prairie like it was still deciding whether the town deserved another day. Clara Whitfield woke in the hayloft with the smell of straw and horses around her, the heavy brown coat still wrapped tight around her shoulders. For a moment she forgot where she was, but then the memory of the freezing night and the quiet cowboy returned. She sat up and pulled the coat closer, feeling its weight and warmth again. The stable owner shouted somewhere below, while horses stomped their hooves against the wooden stalls. Clara climbed down the ladder carefully, the coat hanging long past her hands, and stepped outside into the cool morning air, determined to find the man who had saved her. From the cold, Red Hollow looked different in daylight. The dust glowed gold under the rising sun, and the buildings stood crooked but proud along the main road. Clara walked slowly through town, asking after the cowboy, who wore a brown hat and spoke little. Most folks just shrugged or muttered something about too many cowboys passing through to remember, but an old man sweeping the porch of the general store squinted at her and nodded, saying she was probably talking about Jack Mercer, a drifter who worked cattle drives and kept mostly to himself. The old man pointed toward the far end of town where the ranch hands gathered most mornings near the well. Clara thanked him and started that way, the coat swaying around her legs like it belonged there. Jack Mercer was already there, leaning against the wooden rail beside the well, while the other ranch hands talked about cattle prices and weather coming down from the mountains. He looked up when Clara approached, and his brow lifted slightly beneath the brim of his hat. She stopped a few steps away and slipped the coat off her shoulders, holding it carefully in both hands as she thanked him again for saving her from the cold. The wind tugged lightly at her hair while she waited for him to take it back, but Jack only glanced at the coat once before looking at her tired face and the thin dress that still wasn't meant for prairie winters. He shook his head the same slow way he had the night before and said she might need it more than he did. Clara tried to argue politely, but Jack cut the conversation short with a small shrug and said coats were easier to replace than frozen travelers. The other cowboys laughed quietly at that and went back to their talk. Clara didn't know what to say after that. She stood there awkwardly until Jack asked what she planned to do in Red Hollow now that morning had arrived. When she admitted she had no work and nowhere to stay, the silence that followed grew heavier than the coat itself. Jack rubbed his jaw thoughtfully and finally told her the ranch outside town needed help in the cookhouse. The woman who ran it had left the week before, and the men had been surviving on burned beans and hard bread ever since. Clara hesitated because ranch work meant long days and rough company, but it also meant a roof and steady meals. Jack explained the ranch belonged to old Samuel Grant, a fair man who paid honest wages if you worked hard. Clara looked down at the coat in her hands and wondered if this was the reason she had crossed paths with that quiet cowboy in the first place. The prairie sometimes moved, lives together in strange ways. By midday, Clara rode out of Red Hollow, sitting behind Jack on his horse, the coat wrapped tight around her again as the wind chased them across open grassland. The ranch spread wide against the horizon with long fences and cattle grazing in distant patches of brown and black. Men worked the corrals while dogs barked and dust rose into the bright sky. When they arrived, Jack helped her down and introduced her to Samuel Grant. The old rancher studied her carefully before nodding and saying any friend of Jack Mercer deserved a chance. Clara felt relief wash through her stronger than the prairie wind. Life on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm over the next weeks. Clara rose before sunrise to cook for the cowboys and spent afternoons mending clothes or helping with small chores around the yard. The men treated her kindly enough, though most were too busy to talk much. But Jack passed through the cookhouse every morning and evening, sometimes saying little more than a greeting, sometimes sitting quietly while she poured coffee and asked about the cattle drives he had seen across the western plains. The coat stayed with her through it all, hanging beside her bunk at night and resting over her shoulders when the evenings turned cold. One evening, as the sun bled red across the prairie and the ranch hands drifted back from the fields, Clara stood outside the cookhouse watching the horizon while Jack walked toward her from the barns. The wind lifted the edge of the coat slightly, and he noticed it right away. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth when he saw she was still wearing it. Clara told him she meant to return it many times, but somehow never did. Jack simply nodded and said some things had a way of finding where they belong. Clara didn't answer, but her fingers tightened gently around the coat's worn sleeve. because deep down she had begun to understand that the coat wasn't just keeping her warm anymore. It was tying her story quietly to the man who gave it. Spring crept slowly across the prairie, pushing winter away one stubborn day at a time. The grass turned greener, the cattle grew restless in the open fields, and life at Samuel Grant's ranch settled into something steady and familiar. Clara Whitfield moved through the cookhouse like she had belonged there all along. The smell of fresh bread and strong coffee greeted the cowboys every morning, and laughter sometimes filled the doorway when the long days ended. But through every sunrise and every dusty evening, one thing never changed. The brown wool coat Jack Mercer had given her stayed close, sometimes hanging near the door, sometimes draped across her shoulders when the wind returned. And most days Jack noticed it, but never said a word. Folks around the ranch began to notice other things too, like how Jack always found his way to the cookhouse after long rides, or how Clara's tired smile seemed to brighten when his boots stepped across the wooden floor. Their conversations were simple and quiet, but they stretched longer each week, sometimes about cattle drives and desert storms, sometimes about the strange roads that had brought both of them west. Clara learned Jack had been riding from ranch to ranch for years after losing the only family he ever had, and Jack learned Clara had crossed half the country chasing a better life that nearly froze away one bitter night in Red Hollow. Neither of them said much about the feelings growing between those small moments, but the prairie had a way of making silence speak louder than words. Then one afternoon the sky darkened without warning. Black storm clouds rolled over the plains like an army marching in from the mountains. The wind turned sharp and wild, and the cattle began to scatter across the fields. The ranch hands rushed to gather them before the storm broke loose. Jack rode out with the others while Clara stood in the doorway of the cookhouse, watching the horizon twist with dust and thunder. The coat wrapped around her shoulders again, while the air grew colder and louder. Hours passed before the first riders returned, soaked with rain and mud. But Jack was not among them. Night fell heavy and restless while the storm raged across the prairie. Lightning tore through the sky and thunder shook the ranch buildings like distant cannon fire. Clara waited near the barn with the other hands, refusing to leave even when the rain soaked through her boots. She kept her arms folded tight inside the coat, as if it carried the last piece of warmth in the world. Finally, just past midnight, a lone rider appeared through the sheets of rain. Jack's horse stumbled into the yard with mud up to its chest, and Jack slumped forward in the saddle, barely holding on. The men rushed forward to help him down while Clara's heart pounded harder than the thunder above. Jack had taken a hard fall while chasing scattered cattle across a flooded ravine. Nothing broken, but the cold and rain had nearly drained the life from him by the time he made it back. Clara stayed beside him through the long night, while the ranch doctor worked, and the storm slowly faded beyond the hills. She laid the brown coat over him while he rested because it was the warmest thing she owned. The same coat that once saved her from freezing, now wrapped around the man who gave it without a second thought. The fire crackled quietly in the corner while the first pale light of morning crept through the windows. When Jack finally opened his eyes, he looked around slowly until he saw Clara sitting beside the bed, the coat draped across him and her tired hands resting against the wool sleeve. He gave a faint smile and asked if she ever planned on giving his coat back. Clara looked down at it and laughed softly for the first time since the storm began. She admitted she had meant to return it many times, but it always seemed to stay where it was needed most. Jack studied her for a long, quiet moment before saying maybe the coat had simply chosen its rightful owner. The days that followed brought warmer skies and calmer winds across the ranch. Jack recovered slowly, but he spent more time near the cookhouse once he was back on his feet. The ranch hands joked that he had found a better reason to stick around than cattle work. Clara still wore the coat when the evenings cooled, and no one questioned it anymore, because by then everyone on the ranch understood what it meant. The coat had started as a small act of kindness on a freezing night in Red Hollow, but somewhere along the road it had become a quiet promise between two people who had once believed they were alone. Years later, folks in Red Hollow sometimes told the story of the quiet cowboy and the traveler he saved from the winter cold. They said she came to town wearing a coat far too big for her and never seemed to take it off again. What most people didn't realize was that the coat never truly belonged to one person. It belonged to a moment when kindness changed the path of two wandering lives. Clara Whitfield kept wearing it through many winters beside the man who first placed it on her shoulders. And though the wool grew worn and faded with time, the meaning never did, because the coat that once kept her warm on a lonely night had quietly become something even stronger. It had become home.